Greetings. I am recording this on March 25th. This will be our fifth part in our Lent series on faith-based movements that help shape America. Today, I want to focus on some of the human rights movements that have happened in America during the 20th century. Particularly, I'm going to focus in on the suffrage movement and civil rights movements. Briefly, and how they kind of relate to each other. So to begin, I would like to read a passage from Galatians chapter 3, verses 23 through 28. Now before faith came, we were imprisoned and guarded under the law until faith would be revealed. Therefore the law was our disciplinarian until Christ came, so that we might be justified by faith. But now that faith has come, we are no longer subject to a disciplinarian, for in Christ Jesus you are all children of God through faith. As many of you were baptized into Christ, have clothed yourself with Christ. There is no longer Jew or Greek, there is no longer slave or free. There is no longer male or female, for all of you are one in Christ Jesus. And if you belong to Christ, then you are Abraham's offspring, heirs according to the promise. Amen. So, I bring this up, and I want to begin by looking back a little bit. My second sermon in this series, which hopefully will be uploaded later this week, as I kind of go backwards before this whole coronavirus stuff happened, and upload the rest of the series that I did live. My second one was about abolition, which was about equal rights. And it would be the precursor to the women's suffrage movement and the civil rights movement. And basically, when we look at the suffrage movement and the civil rights movements, we see that while the goals of abolition were this idea of equal rights for all, it didn't complete its goals. That it did have the goal of freeing slaves and ending slavery, but that idea of equality was not achieved during the abolition movement. Now, one of the similarities between the women's suffrage movement and the civil rights movement is that both would pretty much culminate in legislation regarding voting rights. For women's, it was the 19th Amendment in 1920, which gave the women the right to vote, and the civil rights movement in 1965, when it did the Voting Rights Act, which made it so that nobody could be discriminated against in their registering to vote based on race. So, bringing it back to the suffrage movement, many abolitionists were women. Women who were dedicated to this idea of equality. Women that were living virtually as slaves during the 1830s to 1860s when the abolition movement is going on and beyond. Basically, if you're a woman, you weren't allowed to go into certain areas of employment. You were not, if you were married, you were treated as the property of your husband. You could not own property if you're a woman. There was issues with inheritance, where women were not, basically the male heir of the household was given more precedence than the wife, and various other issues where women had a very subservient life in America, and this was really manifested in the abolition movement, because when these early abolition meetings were happening, women weren't allowed to speak at them, which is really kind of interesting when you're fighting for equality for all people, but you're not allowing women to speak at your meeting. It seems pretty hypocritical. And luckily, many of the women that were fighting in this movement, and men as well, pushed back against this, and they got more of the groups that were involved in abolition started allowing women to speak and started treating women more equally. And this would culminate in what was the first women's suffrage convention, or at least what would be considered the birth of the women's suffrage movement, on July 19th and 20th of 1848, where they would have this meeting to establish that the abolition movement wasn't just about ending slavery, but was also about women's rights and human rights in general. And so at this meeting in Seneca Falls, New York, they wanted to pass several resolutions that they would advocate for women, such as divorce rights and property rights, and most importantly, the right to vote, which many thought was really kind of silly at the time. The idea that one would advocate for women's right to vote many thought would actually turn the whole movement into a joke, because the idea was so foreign at this time that a woman could vote, well, like they didn't need their husbands to make their decisions for them, was just so far beyond many people's reality. And I know that's really hard to kind of look back at now in our current society, but that was the way people thought back then, that women just were not educated enough, were not logical enough to vote on their own. And what's really kind of sad is there's still some people who have pieces of that floating around today. At this movement, the person who really advocated for this idea that women should vote was a woman by the name of Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who would become the face of the movement. And the way that she actually won this resolution that they should be about women voting was a young black man stood up while everybody was saying that she was silly, that women shouldn't be fighting for women's right to vote. He stood up and said, no, if you're going to fight for equality for all, and if we're going to get slaves to be freed, we need to have a woman's voice in this, and we need to have their right to vote as well. And that young man was named Frederick Douglass. So Frederick Douglass helped at this point in time. There would be a falling out later, but that's something for you to look up later on your own. But anyway, Elizabeth Cady Stanton would become the first major person for the women's suffrage movement. And it wasn't long after this meeting that she would meet the woman that would become her lifelong friend, Susan B. Anthony. And Susan B. Anthony would form this partnership of for women's suffrage and women's rights. And the big thing was these two women couldn't be any more different from each other. Elizabeth Cady Stanton was married with several children, was constantly at home taking care of her children, whereas Susan B. Anthony would never be married, would never have children, and would dedicate basically her life to spreading the women's suffrage movement. And the two of them, and it was also even in appearance. Elizabeth Cady Stanton was shorter, more plumper, whereas Susan B. Anthony was tall and very thin. It was just like, these two women couldn't look more different, but all that was surface level. They were both of like mind internally. They both had the same convictions in life that this women's rights needed to happen. And basically what would end up happening is that Susan B. Anthony would do all the writing, and Susan B. Anthony would be the person who spreads it everywhere, who either delivers the speeches that Elizabeth Cady Stanton wrote, or passes out the flyers, or recruits more followers and more speakers and more people to join their cause. And they would become really the face of this movement. They would become the core of the movement. And what's really kind of sad is that while that first women's rights convention happened in 1848, it would take until 1920 before they actually got the right to vote. That's 72 years later, that they would finally win that right to vote. And what is even sadder is that both Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton wouldn't live to see it. Elizabeth Cady Stanton would die in 1902, and Susan B. Anthony would die in 1906. By that 20th century, yes, the women's suffrage movement would be nationwide with millions of people advocating, but they would never actually see the fruits of what they always fought for. Meanwhile, while they're fighting and while they're searching for women's rights and while they're hitting all this backlash from men and women, basically telling them that they need to stay in their place, another movement would be starting to bubble up in the 20th century, and that would really be symbolized by the establishment of the NAACP in 1909, which was set up to combat Jim Crow laws, especially in one of the laws that they were fighting was the segregation law, which, if you don't already know, I think most people do know about this, but it was that black people couldn't eat at the same place as a white person. They couldn't live in the same places as white people. They couldn't drink from the same water fountains as white people or go to the same bathrooms as white people. Everything was divided. And in reality, if that had stayed that way and both were treated equally, like the black people's homes and the white people's homes are just as nice as each other and they're just as nice bathrooms, that probably would have lasted for quite a while and nobody would have minded. Unfortunately, it was very clear that those things left for African Americans were nasty, whereas the white people got all the nice stuff. And that's where just kind of the root of the hatred kept growing and growing, and resentment. And this is really sad because, by the time you hit like World War II, where African Americans were allowed to fight in our wars, but especially when you're thinking about a war that was about racism in Europe, where you had the Nazis and they were still treated as second-class citizens at home. And this was really brought to light in the story of Isaac Woodward, who was a sergeant in the U.S. forces who served overseas from 1942 to 1946. And he was returning home on a Greyhound bus, and he asked the bus driver if he could use the bathroom, even though it was reserved for whites only. And here this black man is, full uniform, decorated soldier, fighting Nazis for 4 years, and he was told, "No, you can't. Get back to the bus. Leave me alone." Basically, a brief verbal confrontation ensued, and at the very next stop of the Greyhound, Isaac Woodward was forced off the bus and taken into custody by two police officers, and was then beaten severely. One of the officers would end up taking their nightstick and grinding it into his eyes, and permanently blinding him for the rest of his life. And if you look at pictures, it's really sad. I mean, it's grotesque, and it's anger that somebody who fought so hard for our country and fought for equal rights for other people would be immediately, when he gets home, he's treated this way. And even though that incident would end up getting some national attention, several prominent people in TV and television and radio would pass on that story and to try and bring light to the racial injustice that was happening in the U.S. It wouldn't be until 1955, when Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat in Montgomery, Alabama, that really the civil rights movement would take off. The saying goes is that when Rosa Parks sat down, black people stood up. And that incident would make media celebrities out of not only Rosa Parks as a symbol for the movement, it would also, this is where we learned about who Martin Luther King Jr. is. And the reason for this is that in Martin Luther, our church father, not the civil rights activist. In his time, the reason why he was so successful and the reason why he was able to do what he did was because of the printing press. The printing press had been recently invented, and Martin Luther took good use of that printing press to make sure his word got out there, so that even if somebody tried to hurt him, his word, his message was spread. And in the same way, Martin Luther King Jr., the civil rights, for all my confirmation students, they're two different people, would use television to make sure that people saw the injustice that was happening in the South. And it would become a tool for him, much like the printing press was for Martin Luther. Martin Luther King Jr. would become a national celebrity of sorts, not a public figure at least, because of television, because he would get his message out to so many millions more than just the people in his immediate vicinity. Also, the televisions would come in and record the brutality being done to people who were trying to peacefully protest these segregation laws. These people who were trying to nonviolently resist segregation were met with severe violence at times. And really, that TV brought that to light. And really, what these two movements did, what the women's suffrage movements did, and what the civil rights movements did, was that they really honed in on that idea that the quote from our Declaration of Independence, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, was not a reality in America. And it is, even though we claim it as being one of our core principles, and even though both of these movements had some victories, and they had like kind of these beginning and end points of when we think they began and when they ended, they're still being fought today. They're still not over. Women aren't 100% equal to men. Minorities are not treated in an equal way as white people in our country. It's a hard pill to swallow, but when you look at the facts and figures, it's just a reality. We haven't quite reached it yet, that this battle is still going on, and we've now reached into the 21st century. This is really emphasized in what happened with the Me Too movement, and how it was exposed the rampant sexual discrimination that was going on, and the way that women were treated in businesses, and especially the entertainment industry, and how more and more cases of sexual harassment by people in power of women has continued to come forward, and just exposing just how insidious and how deeply rooted this was in our society. At the same time, we are presented with things like mass incarceration, where we see how prison populations are way too high in our country. And not only that, but then you also have the second-class citizenship that is created through mass incarceration for those people who are then later let out of prison, and how they're treated post being in prison, which is even worse and even has more destructive qualities long term, and how that affects a far higher proportion of minorities in this country than it does white people. All these things show how people are still not treated equally. One of the things I looked up the other day, and I thought this was really just mind-boggling to me. And it's a little bit of an older case, but Catherine Switzer was the first woman to run the Boston Marathon in 1967. And this is what we're talking over 100 years after the beginnings of the women's rights movement. And she was still, people were trying to attack her, to trip her, to beat her up for just running in a marathon in 1967. You think about how we treat people today. Now, over 150 years after the freeing of slaves, and we're still finding ways of characterizing minorities in ways that are very disparaging, and people who are of different genders. It's very sad to me that we still have to fight this fight. And it's important that we do, because this is our calling as Christians. It's sad to me that when we look back at these movements, just like during the abolitionary period, we had churches on both sides. People trying to hold on to the status quo and seeing both of these movements as threats, and they vehemently, angrily, violently fought against them. And still, people on the other side were just as passionately fighting for them. And when we actually look at the story of Jesus, when we look at why was Jesus here? Why did Jesus come to the world? What was Jesus's message to us? And it wasn't to preserve the status quo, to help keep those institutions in power that hurt others. Now, Jesus recognized that there was institutions in the first century, that there was institutions that humans would always have, that deliberately or non-deliberately hurt other people, and that we need to constantly be looking at those movements or those institutions and challenging those institutions to make sure that people are treated fairly and equally. And as Christians, that is our calling, to continue to follow that. To, instead of just say, no, I'm comfortable, I'm fine, and therefore everybody else must be fine as well. But instead, kind of look at what are those institutions that we benefit from and that somebody else might be being hurt by. Because nobody should ever be treated differently based on whether they're black, white, brown, male, female, transgender, or non-binary. And if there's any institution out there, including our own, that treats people differently based on any of these things or any other thing, then we need to challenge that institution, and we need to look at that institution. Because being a Christian is about working towards making this world a better place, to continue moving our world forward. And unfortunately, our world, for every step we make forward, we tend to make another one back, or every couple steps we take one back, however you want to look at it. But we have gotten better. We've gotten rid of a lot of those things that are more obvious forms of slavery, more obvious forms of discrimination. But there's still those things in our world that are more insidious, those things that you can't automatically see, those things that are lying under the surface that we don't always recognize. And we need to challenge those institutions. We need to challenge those ideas so that we can continue trying to create a world that is better for those who come after us. Amen.